Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's the debut episode of my new series, The Trailing Edge. In this particular case, we're going to be examining all the stuff that I missed and round up on my short list for 2017. Let's not waste any time, there's a lot of stuff to get to. In no particular order, Stone Sour's Hydrograd. Side project, the frontman of Slipknot puts out yet another record for his alternative metal group, following their last two-part concept album that was actually pretty decent, and they make a sharp pivot into hard rock. Now in theory, this isn't a bad idea. The band has always got some acclaim for some good melodic structures, most of which they deserve. It's just a shame they got a producer more known for latter-day Anthrax, Jars of Clay, and Bowling for Soup, and who never lets those stronger melodic grooves materialize, which leads to a pretty flat listening experience. I'm sorry. Coupled with the rather sullen lyrics that fly in the face of that same melodic impulse, along with a slew of anti-celebrity screeds that might be well framed but offer nothing interesting or new on that subject, it leads to a pretty monochromatic, overproduced record that can definitely drag, only brightened by guitar solos that deserve a much more anthemic record and a band that actually understands their pop appeal. For me, strong 5 out of 10. Let's move on. Mark Lanegan and Gargoyle.
Your death's head tattoo made me pray for the last one standing, holding a loaded gun.
I have been sitting on this for months, and I'm not going to make any fans with talking about this here. Partially because the former frontman of the Screaming Trees and collaborator of Kurt Cobain himself has a pretty massive solo discography, but also because after revisiting the majority of it, I was not impressed. His solo work was very much a murky, blues-heavy brand of gothic alternative rock anchored in his baritone, basically the more accessible version of Nick Cave that never got as wild, intense, creative, or fun, which is one of the big reasons why his cult following is a lot smaller. Now, putting aside the points where he just was nakedly trying to emulate Nick Cave, he even got PJ Harvey on board, for God's sake. He did try to branch out in the 2010s by fusing in more electronic elements, and not nearly doing it so well throughout the majority of these years. Now, for this project, he decided to pick up a bunch of industrial beats that were outdated in the late 90s, and not given the same grit or proper mix balancing or the depth to match Lanegan's gravelly voice. Now, that's not saying there aren't some decently impressionistic lyrics that can paint a vivid picture. The writing's probably the best part of this album, but the choice to marry so much of it to up-tempo, early 2000s U2-esque bombast is kind of strange, especially opposite the more blatant gothic tones with more organ. It's telling that by far the best songs are the most stripped down and organic country-leaning cuts that place more atmosphere. It's just a shame there aren't more depth and better blending. I mean, it's passable, it's getting a light 6 out of 10, but not any higher. Next up, the self-titled album from TLC. So okay, if TLC puts out a new album 15 years after their last one, partially funded by Kickstarter, and nobody really cares, do I have to cover it? Okay, bad jokes aside, I've been against a new TLC record ever since Left Eye unfortunately passed away years ago. But since TLC blew past that with 3D, about the worst thing they could possibly do is include a sampled interlude from Left Eye giving them carte blanche to do whatever they want. Oh god, they did that too. Well, surely they're not obviously referencing older hits. Oh right, on the first track. Really? But the sad truth is that this is the sort of comeback that not only sounds painfully cheap in a lot of the production, including a Snoop Dogg verse that feels completely phoned in, the melodic foundation of these songs doesn't do nearly enough to support the subject matter that really does not stand out if it's not sampled from a better song. It's Sunny grabs from Earth, Wind, and Fire in the late Bobby Hebb and it actually sounds okay. The production sounds a good decade out of date too otherwise, and increasingly slapdash in many of the instrumental pickups, including the auto-tune and trap snares on Scandalous that they try to smuggle in really badly. And that's before we get to that wonky American Gold song that can really not hit a cohesive point. Yeah, I hate to say it. 4 out of 10. Next up, the Front Bottoms with Going Gray.
the way things used to be. It's okay, no one's around. I'm off season, vacation town. Vacation town.
So alright, I was never the biggest fan of this group, a little bit too sloppy and juvenile at points, although I admired their earnestness, but this sort of proudly sincere folk punk has always struck something of a chord with me. I like the subgenre, and I did like their self-titled album, even if I did find the follow-up Talon of the Hawk kind of thinly produced. But then they signed to Fueled by Ramen, and you know, even though Back on Top was a little bit more polished and electric, it was still pretty damn likable, even if the writing didn't quite seem as eclectic as it had been in the past. Now this unfortunately descends into the overly polished and 80s inflected tones that have plagued Fueled by Ramen to this point over the past year or so, which leaves their folk elements feeling really isolated and really unsupported. And yet the lyrics have stayed as idiosyncratic as the past that might have worked, but unfortunately most default to the sort of detailed but underweight and often painfully basic and cliche songs that don't stick with me at all. Now, for the most part, it's just inoffensive and it's decent enough. There's a few good hooks, but it's also pretty watery and ultimately kind of disposable. Light 6 out of 10. And now, from the newest album from Shania Twain, Now.
Maybe in the sun. Tell me I can get high, give me some.
The pop country queen of the late 90s from Canada makes her big return, and sadly there's a big reason that everybody has stopped talking about it. No matter how much fiddle you pile in to prop up a melody, the horribly cheap vocal production and cartoonishly overblown percussion over melody approach doesn't just feel dated but incredibly slapdash here. For a pop country starlet who used to have effortless charisma, for her voice to sound this contorted and flat and mechanical is downright insulting. This would have sounded dated and sloppy 15 years ago, and with no real groove or serious momentum, or only hints of spiky guitar or fiddle to add some agreeable texture, say nothing of lyrics that feel painfully thin and lacking any sort of nuance or detail. This is a comeback that went incredibly badly and did not deserve any additional attention. There's a reason I didn't cover it last year. Strong 3 out of 10. And now from Beck, Colors.
It's like right now. It's like wow. It's like right now. It's like wow. It's like right now. It's like wow.
Oh, this one hurts, because I've been a fan of Beck, and I've been for years. Hell, I saw him open for U2 in 2017, and he was genuinely terrific. And with every listen, though, I get the idea that there is a satirical edge that he's trying to take Colors in. He's a self-aware songwriter, and ribbing on past their prime acts playing in modern genres is not a bad idea, most because it's more sardonic and wistful than outright caustic. But for a record called Colors, thanks to Greg Kurstin's production, it can't help but feel like it's lacking in that vibrancy, and it feels shockingly overproduced, with percussion and groove once again taking prominence over any sort of melody, except the moments that are trying for a more noisy garage rock dance vibe that really don't flatter Beck much at all, or songs that have him stumbling through a psychedelic piano lines that just feel awkward for him. What's all the more disappointing is that when you have songs like Wow that are genuinely weird and kind of fun in a twisted way, that so much of this record in comparison defaults to drab, overused ideas and textures that remind me way too much of that last Weezer album you've all forgotten about. In other words, light 6 out of 10. PVRIS, all we know of heaven, all we need of hell.
Don't need you to tell me I'm so cynical. Could be so over skeptical. Don't need a metaphor for you to know I'm miserable.
Apparently, this band has received some level of critical acclaim for their blend of synth-heavy pop textures with rock elements, and I have no idea why, especially when they sound like a less ambitious or challenging version of Icon for Hire circa 2013. The music isn't so much bad, but a slurry of genres that lacks definition or driving character, especially in a lot of the writing. And while that was true of their debut, okay, it's still mostly true here, but this record does have a little bit more energy and driving presence. Lanegan is a better rock singer than their production seems to be allowed to to emphasize, which is still painfully washed out and dreary and content to pile on foggy layers on top of everything. Only when the textures and grooves produce something with bite do the songs actually get interesting for me. It's just a shame that the lyrics never really quite do. Even when they do have a little bit more bluntness, they do have some punch, and they do save this record somewhat. So yeah, light 6 out of 10. And now a big one, Khalid with American Teen.
So I'll keep your number safe, cause I hope one day I'll get the pride to call you, to tell you that no one else is gonna hold you down the way that I do.
One of the biggest breakout names in the mainstream this year with multiple singles and big name features, and honestly I'm not quite sure I see the appeal yet. His blend of pop-leaning, brittle melodies cribbing from trap do complement his uncanny knack for decent hooks, but his languid, drawling vocals are trying to infuse a level of soulfulness into broadly sketched lyrics that might capture the contradictions for the modern American teenager, but in going so broad, not nearly seeming as nuanced, especially as his production seems a lot more muted across the record as a whole, which doesn't exactly fit those broad strokes. And sure, there's nothing wrong with the stark basics in a simple song. I see the appeal on this record, but with delivery that I don't really find all that magnetic or soulful, and often projects a really downbeat vibe to even some of the upbeat tunes, it ends up feeling a lot less anthemic than it's trying to be, no matter how many tunes he cribs from 80s synth pop and early 2000s R&B. And that's before we get to the endless stream of toxic relationships or breakups that just gets old. Yeah. Mid-tempo 6 out of 10. And now, from Kelsea Ballerini, Unapologetically.
Miss my own sheets in the bed I made up. I forgot I had dreams, I forgot I had wings, forgot who I was before I ever kissed you. Yeah, I thought I missed you, but I miss me more.
So I was really looking forward to Kelsea Ballerini following up on her debut. There were production problems, sure, but if she was able to smooth out the wonky staccato edges and tighten up some of the songwriting, I thought she had real personality and potential. And it turns out she does show some real improvement here. If anything, it feels like this is what would have happened if Taylor Swift had stayed with pop country after Red instead of going for straight pop, smoothing out the more staccato grooves around some of the more synthetic production while letting the warmer acoustic tones come through pretty damn well. And well, it definitely has some moments that can get a shade too saccharine, especially on the back half, and I really do wish that Kelsea Ballerini had a few more straightforward country songs or instrumentation to pair with all the misty multi-tracking and all the atmospherics. You know what? Her writing remains above average for this subgenre, and with a lot more detail than most pop country will try. Not quite as cutting as Lauren Elena or Lucy Hale or even Casey Musgraves, but trending towards darker, more morally complex territory, and framing of these relationships and breakups is incredibly promising. She's got a knack for it. So yeah, I'm definitely gonna endorse this. It's more pop than outright country, and I know that bothers people, but the sound is a lot better overall. Although, one big nitpick, saying how much you hate love songs right before the next couple tracks are love songs, that's pushing it for me. Very light 7 out of 10. And now, the self-titled project from Sir Roosevelt.
Slow motion, chase the sun as we burn one down. Get high with me tonight. High as a motherfucker, nothing's gonna stop us now.
So it's the album that I don't think anybody's been looking forward to, the pop EDM side project from Zac Brown, with the producer and co-writer responsible for similar crossovers on Jekyll and Hyde, at least the one from 2015. Dropped in the middle of December with little to no fanfare because the label likely has zero faith in it. And after listening through it, I kind of see why. I'm not denying that Zac Brown has a charismatic presence and performer with a better grasp on melody than many in his industry, with an affection for bombast and minor tones that can have a little bit more edge and complexity. And his already broad lyrics, they are kind of a natural fit for EDM, but it's hard not to feel like substituting the rich harmonies for increasingly synthetic multi-tracking and vocal filters neuters some of that impact. And that's before you see Zac Brown's choice of sounds that are a lot less reminiscent of Diplo or Skrillex, who are his cited influences, and more of a mishmash of every EDM and pop trope of the past 7 years. Not exactly helped by his choice to stick more with his less distinct and less powerful upper register. Still, there are a couple decent tunes here, even if it's hard to feel like he just wrote these songs so he could swear in his songs, unlike a lot of mainstream country. But other words, maybe a very light 6 out of 10. Next up, Venenum with Trance of Death. Yeah, this was sitting on my schedule for a long time, and I'll admit a certain amount of reticence to covering this death metal debut, mostly because while I have heard a lot more death metal in 2017 than I ever have before, both on record and live, it's just not really my thing. And I was told this was a standout record in the genre in 2017, and honestly, though this record didn't make me a fan, I can definitely see why people would think that. The interweaving guitar work between the huge rhythm guitar and melody line, it really is excellent. And while I wasn't wild about some of the drum progressions and timbres that were used, overall a little underweight in the low end, which is an issue I would also highlight with a lot of their bass lines and grooves. I do like the willingness to infuse more progressive elements into the sound here, and I actually didn't mind how the growl vocals came through pretty well here. Now, lyrically, I can't really say I was impressed by the abstract, borderline existential nihilism, but there was some character to it. It's not like lyrics are the most important thing in death metal anyway. And on a compositional level, I definitely dug how they were willing to include more elements of black metal, or tempo shifts to intensify that off-killer, haunted vibe. So yeah, for death metal, not bad at all. I actually kind of like this. Strong 7 out of 10. Okay, next up, Der Weg einer Freiheit with Finisterre. Yeah, I know, I bungled that German, but might as well get some melodic black metal on this list. And again, I was told this was one of the best of this year, and I have liked what this group has done in the past, even if I have consistently had issues with their drum production going back to their self-titled debut in 2010. Now, granted, I'm a lot more on the fence about Stellar, the record they put out in 2015, than a lot of critics, but this reportedly is a big improvement, and honestly, I'm not sure it entirely clicks, at least as a whole. I will say this, once I translated the lyrics from German, I actually came to like a lot of these songs a fair bit more, in terms of capturing the bleak but emotive and remarkably human melancholy at the core of the album, which definitely came to bear in a good way with a lot more subdued acoustic and bassy segments. But again, like with their previous albums, for as good as the drum work and tremolo riffing is, and make no mistake, there is a ton of intensity to a lot of these points, the lack of solid crescendos, consistent mix depth, and texture overall means that parts of this album can really start to run together for me. I still think it's pretty good and generally pretty enjoyable, especially digging into some of the fine details of the composition, but I'm not really sure it's gonna stick deeper in the long term for me. So yeah, very light 7 out of 10. And now for some King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard with Polygondwanaland. Look, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not exactly thrilled about my review of Sketches of Brunswick East. A lot of the contributions from Mile High Club to be underwhelming, and comparing it to Flying Microtonal Banana, it was entirely too placid and underwritten for me. But still, not one of my better reviews. Let's try for a do-over, and diving straight into vintage progressive rock, that was bound to work better for me. And yeah, it definitely does, but I can't really say I'm wowed by this either. Mostly because, again, the writing feels pretty thin. The band isn't quite playing to their strengths in the hooks department, and while I am appreciative of their ability to uncannily recreate the tone of, say, like a Yes record from the 1970s, I'm not really as gripped by this as I would like to be. I do like the underlying tension lyrically between the ossified primordial strength of the past and the unknown technicolor future. The title of Polygondwanaland, it's a cute portmanteau of that idea, but beyond that, in some really terrific bass lines, I'm not really loving this as much as I was hoping. It's got some good production, sure, but you know what? A lot of those strong tones, they need to actually go somewhere in the composition, so hate to say it, but it's a strong 6 out of 10. Next up, Maroon 5 with Red Pill Blues.
I need a girl like you, yeah, yeah. Girls like you love fun and yeah, me do what I want when I come through. I need a girl like you, yeah, yeah.
Okay, it's gross, it's underwritten, it's completely lacking in any sort of weight, groove, or personality, features entirely too many guest stars phoning it in, and feels more than ever like an Adam Levine's solo project that not even he seems to give a shit about. The production is formulaic and colorless when it's not tepid in the ugliest way possible, and the less I say about Maroon 5's ugly concern trolling, the better on this record. It honestly reaches the point where you have to wonder whether or not they chose the title by accident, or they were looking to satirize that lovely community. But that would imply imply some effort on Adam Levine's part, and with Red Pill Blues, that definitely did not happen. There's no satirical edge here. With the inclusion of some screamingly disingenuous lyrics and songs like Lips on You, which would require very little to be viewed as far worse than what Adam Levine has intended. It's very telling that his consistent co-writers on this project are Julia Michaels and Teddy Geiger. But what's a little bit less telling is why in the nine hells so much of this record sounds so damn cheap and phoned in. With as big as Maroon 5 has been for so long, it should sound better than this. And no, giving your band 11 minutes to aimlessly jam out on Closure is not an excuse for barely including the rest of them on the goddamn album. In other words, light 3 out of 10. Next up, Ali X with Collection 2.
Hit me on my blind side, left me on the floor. Now I can't see the bright light, body getting cold. There's something about your touch that I can't leave alone. Casanova fucked me over, left me dying for your love.
So this was originally on my schedule near the very beginning of the year and ended up getting dropped through some of the turbulence that characterized my early schedule on Patreon. Kind of regretful of that. But I was curious to go back to this record at some point, and honestly, I was expecting this to be way more interesting given all the hype and critical acclaim this was getting from some circles. Because what I'm hearing is a slapdash Tove Lo riff with more live bass, less reverb, and yet somehow less personality. I mean, Ali X's vocal delivery reminds me a lot of Melanie Martinez, except oddly a fair bit flatter. And yeah, I get that pop is allowed to be vapid, but with a production that does nothing all that challenging or innovative, entirely too many grating, farty synths, and writing that is nowhere near as tight as the synth pop that she wants to emulate, and really having some unfortunate and disquieting implications at the core, this did very little for me. Light 5 out of 10. Next up, Eric Taxon with The Art.
I gotta take you at 6 and write your mama a letter. You better watch yourself, you little Rockefeller. Cause anything you can do, you bet you conquer better. Sounds, samples, arts go on. Cause we won't go music isn't safe anymore. Bang! You better watch yourself, you little Rockefeller. If you go off too soon, you won't return the sender.
So Eric Taxon set a very high bar for himself with Paul, and reportedly he got even more ambitious with this, diving in straight into the glitchy, semi-lo-fi electronic pop that has become his trademark, at least in 2017. And you could tell he was aiming for a slightly bigger sound with this project. The drums and beats are sharper and more pronounced, the synths are more colorful, and we even get some noisy spikes of some fuzzed out guitar, which is pretty well balanced. I will say I'm a little bit more reticent about his rap impulses, especially considering he embraced some of the blown out tendencies of more SoundCloud MCs, but at the same time, that's part of his satirical point that he's trying to make, which is really more about taking the mimetic, self-contained hall of mirrors known as mainstream pop and hip-hop and skewering the whole empty enterprise with a manic intensity that never feels forced. And yet, he's also self-aware enough to know that he wants to be part of that same successful system and seeks the same validation from critics and audiences. Of course, the big difference between this and 21 Pilots, for that matter, with Blurryface, or a band like AJR is the framing and the intensity. He knows enough to question his own artistic impulses in the face of a decomposing world and make the right Charlie Kaufman reference at the right point. I mean, the closest comparison for me here is Max Bemis' work with Say Anything at their prime, and that is definitely a compliment to this writing, especially with songs like The Time We Have, especially considering he's mature enough to take the steps forward in the same way that Blurryface stuck its landing with Not Today. Now, I will say that some of the more slapdash chiptune elements, they lack the refinement or subtlety that characterize the best moments of Paul, but for what this is, Eric Taxon is growing into his own as a potent frontman, and his instincts as a melodic composer, at least, they definitely remain, once again, his biggest asset. For me, very strong 7 out of 10. And finally, one more record from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Gumboot. Their album released on the last day of 2017, reportedly not just B-sides, but with slices of tracks that just didn't fit with their established album themes on the other 4 albums that came out this year, would actually buy to some extent. With a band this prolific, they can't always tie everything together, and you know what, to be fair to this project, most of the songs do actually have similar conceptual themes. Individuals getting way in over their heads in their pursuits, or succumbing to a collective ailment that will then ruin everything, all based on unraveling circumstances that can't quite be comprehended by the standard mind. mind. Where the disconnected elements come into play are more in the production and the presentation. Sure, we get the microtone, garage, or sludge metal inspired psychedelia that absolutely rules, and some great tunes here, but this record also slips towards the languid, retro psychedelia that isn't quite as well delivered or distinct. Even if the horns, they are a nice touch. Still, it's a pretty enjoyable listen. Definitely one of the better projects they put out in 2017, at least in my book. Not quite as good as Flying Microtonal Banana, but probably second after it. And I definitely dug the modern touches about environmentalism in a lot of the writings. So for me, yeah, light 7 out of 10. But yeah, that is my list coming off the debut of The Trailing Edge. That has covered everything that I could get to on my short list for 2017. Let's head into 2018 and see what else will eventually wind up on this edge. But until then, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If you guys want to get involved in my Patreon scheduling process and support this channel, a link to that is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule. And once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. A lot more on that list, right more details right there. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.